Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us again this week. We will begin our webinar in just a few moments. We're going to let the room fill up. I hope you guys are having a wonderful Wednesday. All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again for our weekly Wednesday webinar series. Today's webinar is on using real-world data to inform clinical research featuring robust health. My name is Alsan Murtha, and I'm the Manager of Strategic Communications here at the National Hemophilia Foundation. At any point during the webinar, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We have NHF staff members monitoring these questions, which we will pose to our speakers after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to the community beginning Friday, May 27th. I am joined today by Michael Recht and Moses Miles. Thank you both for taking the time to join us. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Allison. So my name is Moses Miles. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for ATHN, and I'm joined by Dr. Michael Recht, our Chief Science Officer. So Dr. Recht is, as I said earlier, is our Chief Science Officer, and he works at the strategic and policy level to inform our scientific direction at ATHN. He really works across the organization to define, develop, and implement ATHN's science and research strategy. In my role as the Chief Operating Officer, I'm really responsible for all the day-to-day activities and ensure that ATHN is actually executing its mission. So we work really closely together to really deliver on the promise of ATHN. ATHN, the American Thrombosis and Hemostasis Network, is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 2006. We're really focused on securing data, advancing knowledge, and transforming care for individuals affected by hematologic disorders. We do this by sponsoring a national informatics platform that's used by the vast majority of the hemophilia treatment centers in the U.S. We also provide public health services that support clinical care and outcomes analysis, research, advocacy, and public health reporting in different communities impacted by hematologic disorders. So we have four sort of major focus areas. One of those is I'm going to start with informatics and sort of work my way around clockwise. So that's really at the core of what we do. It's like taking knowledge and transforming it into taking data and then transforming that into knowledge. We also have a large public health function where we are focused on conducting public health surveillance and promoting health equity. We have a very large platform around research and public health and biorepository services, which is really designed around being able to construct studies to support the advance of care in various hematologic disorders. And lastly, we have a large software engineering function that's really responsible for actually building the tools that enables these last three focus areas that we have. So in terms of how the community really interacts with ATHN, we have the ATHN Affiliate Network, and it's made up of 146 fairly funded hemophilia treatment centers, as well as 3 non-fairly funded hemophilia treatment centers. We really felt like it's important for these treatment centers that had large patient populations to be able to benefit from the larger hemophilia treatment center network. And then we also have an ATHN affiliate that's in another country where we're bringing them on board to sort of allow them to benefit from the investment in the different technologies and systems we have to support their patient populations. ATHN is also a Healthy People 2030 champion, and so we've been recognized by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. So Healthy People 2030 champions are selected based on their interest and commitment to disease prevention and health promotion, as well as having this larger organizational mission that's aligned with the Healthy People 2030 program framework. And that framework is about creating a society in which people can live to their full potential for their health and their well-being across their lifespan. So that's very much at the core of what we do at ATHN. And now Now we're going to talk a little bit about real world evidence. And for that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Recht. Dr. Recht?
Thanks, Moses. Appreciate it. And thanks for the background on ATHN. So really what I wanted to talk about today is the difference between the kind of data we get from bench research or clinical trials and real world data or real world evidence. And many of the studies that we do through ATHN are great examples of collection of real world evidence. And this is when we use our observational studies like ATHN 7, which is our hemophilia natural history study, or ATHN 8, that looks at the experience of previously untreated patients with hemophilia, or ATHN 9, the experience of people with more severe forms of von Willebrand's disease. And we're not directing how those people are being treated or what they experience with their bleeding disorder, but rather we're collecting data of what their life is like and the treatments that they get. Real world data help us learn about the risk and benefits of different kinds of treatments, and it gives us information about particularly the safety or the effectiveness of various treatments. So what I really want to stress is that real world data is data that's related to a particular individual's health status and the delivery of care that they're receiving. This data can come from the patient itself. And we're going to hear about ATHN's new app, Robust Health, but you can also gain this kind of information from a computer program or from a diary. This is called patient-generated real-world data. We can get data from patient-reported outcomes or surveys. So those people that participate in some of our studies do a panel of these patient-reported outcomes. These are questions that have been validated to determine if people have successes or challenges in various aspects of their life. So for example, there's questions around pain, there's questions around activities of daily living, there's questions around depression and anxiety. And those are called patient-reported outcome surveys. We can also get real-world data from diving into people's electronic health records. They can come in from data that is entered at the treatment center site through specific forms we create called electronic case report forms, or they can come from the government. For example, from public health registries like community counts that many people who are on listening to this webinar participate in. Next slide. Real-world evidence is the evidence that's derived from the data and the routine clinical practice, and it really helps us generate a more holistic or a full view of what a patient actually experiences with their inherited bleeding disorders. This type of evidence can be used. I'm sure many of people have heard about the use of big data, and this is really how this type of evidence is used to develop high-powered analytics. We as physicians or physician researchers or providers of all types use this type of real-world evidence to help us make decisions in recommending treatments. It helps us determine what's most efficacious. Efficacious is how things work in the perfect world versus what's effective, what works in the real world. And then it helps us assess risks and benefits for various medications, and it helps us make recommendations to improve other patient outcomes. So next slide, please. So really, we use this real world evidence to help us close the gap from what we learn from controlled clinical research and what's done every day. And really, I think the best way to think about this is in our research protocols, we're asking the question, what can happen under optimal conditions? And in the real world evidence world, we're asking what really happens in the day-to-day. Based on how a natural history study is designed, we can get this type of data over a long period. So in our natural history studies, our new natural history study that's going to encompass all inherited bleeding disorders, we're really looking for evidence over about 15 years. So if someone elects to enroll and participate in ATHN Transcends, which I'm going to talk about next, they're signing up for a 15-year commitment if they continue to want to participate. Next slide, please. So clinical research really is at the heart of all the advances that occur in medicine. It helps us understand if a new medicine works and is safe, if a combination of existing medications work and are safe. It helps us figure out, not me personally, because you don't want me doing surgery on you, but it helps surgeons figure out if a new procedure works or any kind of new device works. And the goal of a clinical trial is, number one, is that new medication or combination of medication or procedure or device, is it safe? Once we figure out is it safe, we want to figure out if it actually works. So next slide. So when you as an individual participate in medical research, there are a couple benefits. The first is we're really contributing to moving science forward. So whether the new medicine or procedure or device you're using is found to be beneficial or not, we learn information about that medicine or surgical procedure or device. So by participating in clinical research, just moving the field of medicine forward is one of the primary goals. We also know that by participating in clinical research, you're helping your fellow people, right? So by being part of clinical trials and moving medical field forward, that this is going to help other people in our society and worldwide. And finally, the funny thing about clinical research is when you get a new medicine or a new procedure on a clinical trial, because the details of how that trial are so specific, it turns out that the outcomes of people on clinical trials for a medicine that's safe and effective is usually better, and I'm stressing usually because it's not always, but usually is better than what you see in the real world, because the real world, as you can imagine, is a little bit more loosey-goosey than the kind of prescriptions that happens when you're on a clinical trial. So, for example, using hemophilia as an example, when people are on clinical trials for new factor products, and we calculate the annualized bleeding rate for the population of people on the trial, it's usually lower than what we see in real world data after a product is approved. Okay, next slide. So ATHN has a bunch of studies. So about 6 years ago, ATHN got into the research game after ATHN systems were created in order to help collect the data for the federal programs in which we're involved. And it turns out that the system that was created was also a really great system to collect research quality data. So we had the really cute idea of naming our studies consecutively, because we thought, by 20 years, we'll be up to ATHN 15 or so, and we'll have created a bunch of new knowledge. Well, it turns out that ATHN has been successful beyond all of our imagination 6 years ago. And you can go to the next slide. And we're already up to ATHN 17 in just those 6 years. because of the complexity of the studies that we're doing and the number of studies that we're doing, last year, or about 2 years ago now, I undertook a project to help simplify the data collection, to harmonize the data we were collecting between all these different studies, and make this one big natural history study, ATHN Transcends, available to be open at every single treatment center in the United States. So let's go to the next slide and talk about ATHN Transcends. ATHN Transcends is our natural history study of the safety and the effectiveness of treatment for people with non-neoplastic hematologic disorders. So that's a fancy way of saying non-cancer blood disorders. So next slide. ATHN Transcends was all based on our initial ATHN 7 hemophilia natural history study. But what we decided to do, instead of just follow people with hemophilia, we've decided to design this study to give us the possibility to study people with essentially any inherited bleeding disorder. So taking the framework from ATHN 7, we have designed this study to be able to collect data from people with hemophilia, with von Willebrand's disease, with other rare bleeding disorders, with congenital platelet disorders, and even collecting data from people who have bleeding symptoms, but we as physicians might not be smart enough to figure out exactly what's causing. That cohort is called the bleeding NOS, or not otherwise specified. It's now also known as bleeding of unknown cause. Because we've had interest in this way of collecting data, we actually created another cohort called the non-neoplastic hematologic conditions cohort. This has the possibility of having nothing to do with bleeding. We have interest in researchers in other blood disorders in working with us and collecting the same kind of data we're collecting in people with inherited bleeding disorders for conditions that they treat, such as sickle cell or a platelet disorder that's not a disorder you're born with, but one you acquire, called immune thrombocytopenia, or ITP. So this is the general layout. This is what the data collection, the next slide looks at the data collection of the kind of data that we collect when someone is enrolled on ATHN Transcends. So if you can go to the next slide and then click again. At baseline, after we get informed consent, the site staff does a deep dive into the medical history of the people that enroll. So essentially figure out everything that's ever occurred in this person's life medically. So any previous surgeries, any previous diagnoses, heart disease, cancer, liver disease, other infections, joint problems, everything that you would think about. We review their pattern of bleeding events. We review their current treatment plan. People do complete a panel of those patient-reported outcomes. And then if they do have a bleeding disorder, we offer genetic testing to see if we can figure out the genetic variant that might be causing their bleeding disorder. And if someone has a condition in which they have to have factor replacement, we do offer inhibitor testing at the time of enrollment also. Click again, please. Every quarter, we do an evaluation of any kind of adverse event that someone might have experienced over the last 3 months. We pay attention to the adverse events that are collected by our colleagues in Europe who have a more specific safety surveillance system for people with hemophilia. So we have completely harmonized our data collection with how they're collecting data in Europe. So we will be able to either compare or aggregate the data that we collect in the United States with the data that's collected in Europe. We review whether any other new medical events have occurred over the past 3 months. We review any bleeding events that have occurred over the past 3 months. And then if there were any changes in the treatment plan, we make sure to note those. Click again, please. Every year, we go through that exact same exercise, but at that annual evaluation, we also retest for those patient-reported outcomes to see if the intervention that people are using is improving or causing a decrease in quality of life. And then we offer that inhibitor testing again yearly. Next click. And then when someone's ready to leave the study, hopefully 15 years later, we go through everything again. If someone has something happen while they were on ATHN Transcends and need to be seen in the clinic, we do have the ability to collect any kind of data that would be collected at those extra clinic visits. Okay, so next slide. One of the things that I've really paid attention to since coming on to ATHN a little over 2 years ago is to make sure that the results of all these studies that we're doing gets communicated as widely as possible. So initially, me as a clinical researcher, I think, well, we need to publish more papers in scientific journals. But that's not the only thing we're doing. We are working very closely with our friends at the NHF to develop a communication plan that really gives us the opportunity to let people know the results of the study they're participating in. And essentially, this is a way to thank people for participating in these trials. Essentially, because of the effort that you're putting in to participate in our trials, this is the new knowledge that we have learned. And this is how we're going to use this knowledge to better the lives of people with inherited bleeding disorders. Okay, next. So I talked to you about how we collect data and how we collect patient-reported data. But up until now, we've been collecting that data by people at the center asking participants in our trials questions. We wanted to come up with a way in which we could collect the data more directly from the people affected by these conditions that are participating in the trials. And Moses is going to jump back on and talk about our new application that helps us collect the kind of data that we would like to use. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Mike. So as Mike said, we wanted to find a way to really capture this patient journey, be able to support it as far as it relates to ATHN Studies, but also more broadly to be able to support sort of the clinical care for patients and facilitate that conversation between patients and their providers. So, when we took this on, realizing that we are not a patient-facing organization, we actually worked with 4 of the ATHN affiliates who have large patient populations, that are using various bleed logs and other digital applications for capturing their patients' journeys. So we got the experience from those organizations, from those treatment centers, and from their patients, incorporated into the build out of this new application that we think unifies these different ways of viewing the data and capturing data and making it easier to participate for those patients that are participating in ATHN studies to be able to participate in those studies. So that we sort of pulled all that together into this new app called Robust Health. Robust Health is available now on both for Android, so on the Google Play Store, and for iOS, so in the Apple Store, for patients now to be able to download and actually have this view of their experience for their healthcare. So there's sort of 4 core aspects to Robust Health. We're collecting data around bleeds and treatment logging, individualized goal tracking, the questionnaires and the surveys, so the questionnaires, the PROs that Mike mentioned earlier. And then there's also this reporting component, all of which I'm going to dive into a little bit more. So we think through sort of how we were collecting bleeds and treatment logs. As Mike said, for the ATHN Transcends, they were doing these quarterly calls. So we wanted to find a way to have a really robust way for patients to be able to report that information themselves. The goal was to do this in as interactive and engaging way as possible. So we built Robust Health to be that application. And we've gotten feedback from patients along the way through the development process to really refine this approach. You can see here from the different screens, there are multiple ways for actually completing the data, and we try to make it as interactive as possible. So we spent a lot of time building body maps and other tools to make it easy to put data in. In addition to that, one of the things we are building out now is a way for patients to be able to report bleeds and treatments via text messaging. So the way that would work is that rather than going directly to the app, you'll be able to text your bleed or treatment and then the application will actually will receive that text and record it into the application. And then once it's there, if you choose to, then you can share it with your treatment center. We also built into this idea of having individualized goals. So there's a project called GoalHeme that allows for population-based individualized goals. And so what we've done is incorporate that concept into the Robust Health application. The way this will work is that you and your provider will work together to define the goals that you are most interested in achieving over a set period of time. Those goals will be transmitted to your Robust Health application. And then once there, you can actually track your progress on those goals. You'll be able to report in how you're doing, see your history as it relates to those goals, and then share that back with your clinical care team, and then you'll be able to talk through kind of how you're doing and have this sort of more informed conversation about your overall experience as a patient. In addition to that, we also want to be able to track sort of quality of life as it relates to the different PROs and other outcomes. So we built that directly into the application. The way this works is that the PROs that Mike mentioned that would be part of potentially like an ATHN Transcends or other study, or additional surveys that your clinical care team might think is important to capture, those can be sent directly to the Robust Health application. The application, you can then fill it out there, and then it'll be sent back to your provider. So try to make this as seamless and easy as possible for you to be able to report what your experience has been like as part of your treatment plan. And lastly, we wanted to make sure that we were providing this information back to the patient and having different ways of reporting that out. So we built in some of these initial reports based off the data that's collected in the application. And this is an area where we know we're going to spend a lot more time refining as we get more feedback from patients. We want to make sure that we are building in tools that makes the data that you're putting in really useful to you, in addition to being useful for providers and for any studies that you might be participating in. So as you're using the application, we want as much feedback as possible about any aspect, but in particular around this reporting, because we want you to get a lot of value out of the tool yourself. So I want to thank you for the opportunity for us to speak to you today about Robust Health and sort of in ATHN and the ATHN Transcends project. And I want to turn it back to Allison for questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Give me 1 second. Yeah. Ooh. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for sharing that. That was amazing. If you have any questions, just feel free to throw them into the Q&A feature. I do have a couple for you guys real quick. Let's see. My first one is, what can be some of the biggest challenges in collecting real world data?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think there is a couple issues, a bunch of issues of collecting quality real world data. And I think that's the very first issue, is collecting quality real world data. So for example, the people who have inherited bleeding disorders lead very busy, complicated lives. the people who work hemophilia treatment centers who hope to care for people with inherited bleeding disorders have a busy work schedule. Even the centers that are big enough to have dedicated data entry people, still the issue is having the bandwidth or the time to collect data appropriately from individuals with these conditions. So time is the number one. Second, data quality. So if I ask you, how many bleeds have you had in the past 3 months? For example, if you have hemophilia or another inherited bleeding disorder, that's very different than if you use Robust Health and log in your bleed every time you have a bleed, or log in every dose of factor or every medication that you take. So recall data versus data that is collected when something's actually happening are two very different things. And then just the idea of completeness of data. So through ATHN systems, we can collect the study data that we have, which is very specific and is precise in when and how we collect it. But we also collect another type of data, and that's just extracting data out of a medical record. And the completeness of that kind of data can be variable. So for example, when we went, when COVID became a thing, when the pandemic started in March of 2020, and we moved to virtual appointments, something as simple as tracking weight became very difficult, right? It used to be go to the doctor, get on the scale, you'd have a weight every time you go to the doctor. For the past 2 years, we've had trouble collecting weights because we've been talking to people over the computer, and not everybody ask a patient to please step on a scale, or people don't have a scale at home. So we don't have necessarily up to date. So time, quality, and completeness are really I think the three biggest issues with collecting real world data.
Awesome, thank you. How is the confidentiality of patient information protected via the app?
That's a great question. So the first thing is that the application has a couple of ways of operating. But first is that you as an individual can choose not to link your data to back to your treatment center at all. So the data will just reside on your phone. The reality, and then the other way is that if you choose to connect to your treatment center, then your data will be shared with your treatment center, but only you and your treatment center will be allowed to have any view into that data. We use a number of mechanisms to secure that. So we encrypt the data between the transfer back and forth between the systems. When the data is actually recorded back into your treatment center, once it's there, it's actually encrypted on our side as well, so that there's at no time is that data sort of free and unencrypted and available for anyone to actually view into it. And then lastly, ATHN as an organization, we don't have a view into that data. That's between you and your treatment center, unless you choose to share that data with, as part of the ATHN data set, if you participate in that project, or if you participate in one of the other ATHN study projects.
Great, thank you. How does the app link up with the patient's HTC?
So when you go through the process of registering in the application, when you create your account, you have the option of identifying your treatment center. So you can select your treatment center, and then what will happen is your treatment center will receive a request from your application to link to the record they have at their treatment center. So they then have to approve that linkage. So they'll say that, John Smith, who's using this application, has put in enough information for us to be able to uniquely identify him in the Robust Health app. We know that this is going to be John Smith in our systems here, and we'll allow that linkage to create. So that's how that occurs. At any time using the application, you can turn that linkage off. So it's not just within the control of your treatment center. That way we have this sort of two-way check. The treatment center checks it, you're signing off on it for the interactions to ensure that there's that secure linkage between the app and your treatment center.
Wonderful, thank you. What pros are you using in both the Robust Health and Transcend?
So I'll start, Moses, and then maybe you can pick up. So in Transcend, we do have a panel of patient-reported outcomes or pros. We have elected to use non-hemophilia specific pros. There are a bunch of very specific hemophilia patient-reported outcome tools. Our strategic decision was to use patient-reported outcome tools that have been validated throughout the entire population of the United States. And the idea is that, number one, by using these non-hemophilia specific patient-reported outcomes, we will be able to compare results between people with different inherited bleeding disorders and be able to compare with the US population in general. So the base PRO that we use is the age-appropriate PROMIS, PRO-MIS, PROMIS profile. That is a tool that's available through the National Institutes of Health. We also do both the EQ5D5L, which again is a 5-question general health tool, and use the 100-point visual analog scale. We have created a 1-question generalized adherence scale that has been modified from Veritas Pro, but we chose to ask just the 1 question because while we were designing ATHN Transcends, there was not a adherence questionnaire for people on subcutaneous medications like emicizumab. So we decided to extract this 1 question from Veritas Pro that essentially asks, how are you doing in taking your medication like your doctor prescribed? And then we've worked with one of the funders of ATHN Transcends, Genentech. They have created a hemophilia specific PRO called CATCH. And it's very much like the SF36, has 7 different domains. And the first version has been validated for people with hemophilia. That is just in the hemophilia cohort of ATHN Transcends. And that is undergoing a complete redesign to cut down on the number of questions that are being utilized. And then finally, we're just incorporating a distress scale that's been designed and validated by Dr. Christine Kempton in Atlanta.
So when it comes specifically to what's available in the application, today it's limited to the PROMIS profile, and we are sort of thinking through the expansion from that. Not all of these PROs are actually allowed to be delivered via another application. There are some licensing limitations for some of them. So we're sort of working through some of those more administrative or legal issues to incorporate some of these others into the robust health application. And over time, we expect to continue to sort of expand and add additional other PROs. ATHN also has another application that we didn't talk about today called our uniquely named ATHN PRO application, which is also designed to deliver PROs to patients in different electronically. So you can do it while you're in your doctor's office, or while you're at your HTC, or even from home in some cases. So in that application, we have the CATCH, we have the PROMIS profile, and several others embedded in that one. So the robust health application will expand over time with additional PROs and surveys.
Great, thank you. Will the app link to other patient registry platforms such as NHF's Voices in Research?
That's another really great question. We have a fantastic collaboration with NHF that's really been strengthened a lot over the last several years. And so we are in conversations with them to think about how best to not only just promote the use of this of Robust Health and make it more available, but also how we can work together to sort of, harmonize data collection across the community and expand and support each other. So we're sort of thinking through that. We don't have anything specific to announce today, but that is something that we are thinking through and exploring.
Great, thank you. So how many people are using the Robust Health app currently, and how many HTCs?
Another great question. I know that we have not made a big push for the application. We've been doing effectively what's called a soft launch. We are at, I know, 119 patients who have decided to link their patients to their treatment center. So that's as much as we sort of know. There may be others who are using it and are not connecting back to their treatment center. So I don't have a good visibility into that data at this point. We are going to be making a large push throughout the HTC network, as well as through our partners at NHF and other advocacy organizations, to make this more available to treatment centers and to patients as we move forward. So I expect those numbers to actually go up a good bit. I don't have specific numbers today around which treatment centers which patients and treatment centers are actually using the application beyond that rough 119 or so patients we know that are linking back to their treatment centers.
That's still great. That's a good number for a soft launch.
It is. We're really happy with the progress that we've made. So
Awesome.
I really thank the patient community for adopting it. We've gotten really good feedback from all the patients that have been using it. Some things though about how we can improve it. A lot of positive feedback just about how happy they are with the application. So we're thrilled with that. Right now the level of acceptance has been quite high. We're very happy.
Awesome. Well, I do have a couple more for you, but if anyone else has any additional questions, make sure you throw them in the Q&A feature. Do you think or know if people might enter this data differently, knowing their HCP will have access, just such as wanting to show that they adhere to treatment more often than they actually do?
Mike, I'm going to defer to you on that one.
It's a big question. Sorry.
That is a fascinating question. So, that's always a possibility. I'll reflect on that a little bit. Back when we went through a period in one of the treatment centers I worked with where we were very much stressing the use of paper logs. This was before cell phones, smartphones. And, I was walking through the waiting room to get to clinic, saw one of my patients huddled over something, writing very quickly. And, I came into the room to see him and I'm like, dude, at least you shouldn't have used the purple pen for every single entry you did. It sort of gives it away. So I guess, certainly as a provider, I am not going to chastise anybody for not being adherent to my recommendation, right? I want people to live the best life that they can, achieving the goals they want to achieve. And if giving medicine at the recommended dose and interval that I recommend doesn't work for them, I hope they're not using paper or electronic diary forms to make it up. I would hope that we can have a discussion about how we can better approach a therapy that works for them. Len, I see you popped on. Do you have a comment?
No, I was going to ask a question.
Okay, so I think I'm done with that.
Okay.
That's certainly a possibility. We hope it's not. We hope that any kind of inability to follow recommended treatment leads to discussion, not to making up treatment logs, whether paper or electronic.
Yeah. So Mike and Miles, thank you very much. This was really informative. So Mike, maybe can you talk a little bit about how you see real world data might be used for advocacy efforts, maybe in terms of understanding treatment patterns and effectiveness of those treatments, and then how an organization like NHF could use that type of real world data in our advocacy efforts?
Yeah, so that's really good. So Len, this goes back to a discussion, it's more of an electronic discussion, but a discussion we were having recently about careers in hematology and how it's not just clinician or clinical researcher or bench researcher, but advocacy is becoming a much bigger part of being, part of your career as a treater of people with inherited bleeding disorders. So I think that's something you and I both support and 100% get behind, that, we hope that people who are moving in this career feel that a way to really make an impact is to use the kind of data that we collect through these real world projects to advance the care of people with inherited bleeding disorders. So let me use a very specific answer. There is an organization called ICER, I-C-E-R, and off the top of my head, I can't remember what ICER stands for, but what they are, they're an independent organization that evaluates the effectiveness and value of new therapies as they are going through clinical trials and come onto the market. And ICER's recommendation are often used by insurance companies or payers or Medicaid and Medicare to make a decision whether they're going to pay for a new therapy. So a couple of years ago, ICER did an evaluation of the value of gene therapy for hemophilia A and emicizumab. And before they did their evaluation, they put up on their website all their suppositions that they were going to use for these evaluations. And part of their thoughts was data in how much factor people on prophylaxis were using to determine how factor usage and emicizumab would compare to each other, and how factor usage and potentially no longer requiring factor after receiving gene therapy would compare to each other. And the numbers that they were planning on using were quite a bit lower than what I, as a treater, either prescribe or have seen other people prescribe. So what we did was use Athens real world data and take the thousands and thousands of people that with severe hemophilia A and hemophilia B and ask, how much factor are they actually using with each dose? How much are they using on a weight-based basis? So like how many units per kilogram? How frequently they're infusing factor? And we were able to show ICER that their suppositions were well off the mark, almost half of what people were using in the real world. And they took our data and used that to reanalyze the cost benefit and value of both emicizumab and hemophilia A gene therapy. They are going through that exact same exercise right now, reevaluating hemophilia A gene therapy and evaluating hemophilia B gene therapy for the first time. And just yesterday, I sent a letter to them updating the data that I had sent 2 years ago.
Excellent. So, I think, demonstrating the value of the medications and the treatments and the care that's provided in hemophilia treatment centers is critical, to ensure continued access to care. We're seeing that there are other ways that access to care, access to treatment, access to hemophilia treatment centers is being challenged. For example, payers have instituted things like what are called copay accumulators, or copay maximizers or other alternative funding schemes where patients and families are having challenges accessing their treatments, which we all know are very expensive. So my question is, how might real world data be helpful to better understand these types of barriers to access to care? And how might we then use that real world data to overcome these types of barriers that are being put forward?
So that's super interesting. So thanks for that, Len. That's really thought-provoking. This goes back a little bit to what the CDC was trying to collect, gosh, at the beginning of community accounts, maybe all the way back in 2012, I think. They tried to do that project where they wanted to count the number of people who didn't have access to hemophilia treatment centers or chose not to get their care through federally supported hemophilia treatment center network centers. So what we at ATHN have done is, ATHN is by and for the United States Hemophilia Treatment Center Network centers, but we've also reached out to centers where we know that a certain number of people with inherited bleeding disorders get their care who are not part of the treatment center network. So we have ATHN affiliate agreement with Duke, and help me with this, Moses, Duke, Columbia, Medical University of South Carolina, Loma Linda. Anybody else?
I think that's it.
Yeah. So we're going to be able to compare people getting, state-of-the-art care through these centers that aren't part of the treatment center network to people who do get their treatment through treatment center network hospitals, centers. So, that certainly would be an example of where we'll be able to advocate for the treatment center network, demonstrating, I'm assuming, right, we don't have this data yet, but I'm assuming that the morbidity will be less in centers where a full hemophilia treatment center staff is available. So that would be one way. This idea of the copay accumulators or copay maximizers, I'm trying to remove my bias of this evilness of the insurance companies by doing this to our patients. But, I think by collecting the kind of data that we do, particularly the patient-reported outcomes and how having hemophilia and all the aspects of having hemophilia, including, the inability to change jobs. A lot of things got better with the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, but still there are a lot of people that have trouble making their co-pays, and with these accumulators, it makes it even more difficult. So we could be able to pick up those kind of anxiety and depression and difficulty with work-life balance that we have by collecting this kind of data.
Yeah, I think it's really important that the more that information that we could put around these types of issues and how significant they are in terms of access to care. So for example, one way might be to look at events of bleeding or emergency room visits that occur when patients don't get access to their medications in a timely way.
Right.
All of those are, expenses that could be averted.
Yeah, I think the main issue though is the data, the majority of the data that we're collecting are from the best centers in the country. Right. So we have the 140 plus hemophilia treatment center who think about this every day. So we're not really collecting data from the people who are getting their care from places that don't think about emergency department avoidance or, things like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this really emphasizes how important it is for people in our community to participate either, in formalized research, which, involves, maybe that's a new drug study to advance care or a new treatment, or other types of formalized research, but also the participation in the collection of real world data that really helps inform clinical practice and how people are doing, in their lives, not, under the auspices of a controlled research trial, but in everyday life, which is really what's important. And I think, I can't emphasize more how important this is for people to consider participating in research and allowing the data that's collected through their hemophilia treatment center to contribute to these types of efforts to generate real world evidence that can be used to benefit their care.
Yeah, I really appreciate that vote of confidence, Dr. Valentino. And, that as ATHN, that's really our mission as an organization. And I guess the logical extension of what you're saying is, if an individual who might be listening to this today has an inherited bleeding disorder and is interested in participating, call your center and say, I'd like to be on ATHN Transcends. See what the response is.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Moses. This was really informative. I hope our audience found it equally enlightening. So back to you, Allison.
Thanks for joining, Len. I appreciate it. We do have one last quick question. And have you received any data so far in Transcends on non-bleeding disorders?
So we don't have any yet. We're in discussions with providers and clinical researchers in other fields, but those discussions are very much in the preliminary phases.
That was great. Thank you guys so much. I'd like to thank you both again for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We appreciate your time and expertise. I'd also like to thank each one of our viewers for joining us. Please note that this recorded webinar will be available on Friday, May 27th at hemophilia.org under the events tab with all of our archived webinars. Also available in the events tab is our upcoming schedule for our weekly Wednesday webinar series. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon and have a wonderful week.
Thank you very much,
Thank
everybody.
Thanks.